All right, so this morning while I was making the video on the 100-hour work week, as soon as I finished it, I had another idea for a video because it's something I've struggled with my entire life, and that's reliable transportation. For 20 years, I had to ride the bus anywhere that I couldn't walk to or ride my bike to easily. And even at my current job, when I started working there, I had to get rid of my bike because I needed the money because something came up. And then I was walking to work. And then I thought about how many times I've been in a job interview where the job interview ended the second they noticed that I didn't have a car. That was it. That was the end of the interview. They're like, if you're too poor to afford a car, you can't work here. And it's not that, it's not that cut and dry. It's they mask it behind certain questions to make certain that you're not going to be that guy who never shows up on time and then always says it's not their fault. So the struggle of relying on public transportation, particularly buses for work, highlight deep systemic issues in our society. It's frustrating because the deck seems stacked against those who can't afford a car. And it is very, very true. If you can't get a job because you don't have a car, and this isn't a driving job, this is an office job or a retail job. And if you look around in any Kroger's or a Walmart, you're going to see that a large portion of your coworkers are walking to work. And it's not by coincidence. If you don't have parents that are wealthy enough to provide you a car, the free car, like I did, the first year that I was driving my parents' car. And it wasn't my car, but at least I had access to a car. But once my parents were gone, I could never, for the rest of my life, I could never afford a car again. And um, I've got six talking points here that we're going to go through. So each one, I'm going to use my personal stories in order to relate to these. So unreliable bus systems. If you've ever had to take the bus, you know that they don't always show up on time. They do break down, and some of the characters on the bus are so terrible. And I've mentioned this story before, but I was going down Mill Avenue one time, and this dude, his feet smelled so bad that everyone got off the bus, including the bus driver. And this guy smelled so terrible, he had to get a some sort of paperwork from the city. He had to apply for some sort of permit to be allowed on public transportation because he cleared the bus because he smelled rancid. And you're talking about a closed environment. You're not getting a lot of fresh air inside the bus. So whatever your neighbor smells like on the bus, you're smelling it too. Whether it's his feet, it's vomit, it's urine, it's number two. It's very, very unreliable in every sense of the word. And sometimes bus drivers get so used to people just lingering at bus stops that they'll just ride right past you. If you don't signal to them that you want to get on the bus, they'll go right past you because most of the bus benches are used by undesirable people. We all know who those people are and we've seen them, and a lot of people meet their maker at these places because they just sit there and succumb to the elements while under the influence. Not that that adds to the unreliability of the bus, but it is a terrible, terrible system. Anything that caters to poor people, you put the word public in front of anything, and it makes it disgusting. Talking point number two, limited coverage. Not all areas of suburbs are industrial zones as are well serviced by public transit. Some jobs are practically inaccessible without a car. When I lived in Chandler, there was no bus coverage on that road. They assumed that the people who lived in that area where I was renting a room from those boomers, that everyone there had their own car. Bus systems are built around poor people, at least out here. I know that in places like New York, that the trains and the buses, the public transportation is designed for everyone. Here in Arizona, and I imagine most other non-densely populated states, you you succumb to limited coverage when it comes to the whatchamacallit, not only the roads that they're on, but also the times. Like sometimes there's no coverage on the weekend. And guess what? Poor people work on the weekends, poor people work all of the time. So having limited coverage of your buses makes it very difficult. And here in Tempe, we have orbit buses. They're these half-size buses that are free. And again, what did I just say? Free. Anytime you add the word free or public to something, it attracts a certain demographic. Therefore, if you want to ride the free bus, you're going to be on there with people who can only afford free. And you don't want to be in that situation if you don't have to be, especially as a young lady alone. Stigma against bus riders is number 3. Employers often equate bus reliance with instability or lack of reliability. That is very true. If you're on the bus, chances are you're going to be on there with lots of other single men. And I've only met one woman on in 20 years of being on the bus that I got on there. She was wearing a Circle K uniform. I was sitting across from her, and she had amazing feet, right? Well, we got off that bus, and she wanted to go back to her place. I was too scared at the time, and I didn't pursue that. But she was a very, very attractive woman. Why she was on the bus and living in Ahwatukee at the time, I don't know. Must have had a boyfriend that had money and then broke up with her and then left her in the apartment. That's the best that I can come up with because anyone that works at a gas station isn't going to afford to live in a nice luxury apartment in Ahwatukee. All right, moving on. Unrealistic schedules. Many workplaces, especially in low wage or shift based jobs, have irregular hours that don't align with public transportation schedules. Late night, early morning shifts can make commuting nearly impossible. Unrealistic schedules is very much so a problem with the city buses because they assume that they're going to cater to people who work 8 to 5. And yes, the buses are extremely busy during 8 to 5. But there's also a large segment of people who don't work those hours. When I worked at Walmart, it was a mid afternoon to early morning. There's no buses running at 2 o'clock in the morning. That means if you want to get home, you're going to walk or you're going to ride your bike. Again, this is why it's so difficult in order to get a job when your transportation is extremely limited. People don't think about this that have ever had to, who don't have to rely on public transportation, but it is a terrible, terrible way to live. And there's only, I was going to mention another story, but it's not applicable in this situation. Okay, so number 5 is the cost. While bus fares may seem cheaper, the time spent commuting, sometimes hours each day, comes at a high cost to quality of life and productivity. I'm telling you, if you've got to commute a long distance, like my longest bus ride was from South Chandler to North Scottsdale, 2.5 hours each way. That meant that I had 5 hours of sitting on the bus every single day in order to get to work. And if you're wondering, it's like, why would you pick a job that was that far away from your house? I had no choice. I got called by a recruiting agency, and they looked at my resume. It's like, hey, we can place you at this corporation. Unfortunately, it's all the way on the opposite side of the Phoenix metro area. The money made it worthwhile, but at the cost, no, I would never do that to myself again. When I took that job, I was already on the street, so I had extra willpower in order to do things that you normally wouldn't do unless you were already on the street. So I had to decide what I was going to do at that time, and there was no real choice, and I had no other job opportunities, and they wanted me to start right away. So what are you supposed to do? You stay with someone that you kind of know while you get back on your feet. And by the time you get back on your feet, you've lost your job. You've been laid off again. These kinds of disasters are very normal for poor people. It's not uncommon for people to end up homeless while you're working or in between jobs. It just happens. If you don't have a family, you better believe you're going to spend a lot of your time either sleeping on someone's couch or sleeping on the street. So, number 6 says many employers fail to understand the reliability of working class life. Realities of working class life. And that's something that I've had to kind of just get over, because the reality of the way that the proletariat lives and the way that corporate America thinks that we live, like when they can't fill positions, they just assume that it's because people don't want to work, right? But sometimes it becomes much more difficult than that. When I worked at Walmart, the Walmart was here in Tempe, and you can't really find a lot of people that want to work in this area for at that place. So a lot of the employees that came to work there were from rough neighborhoods that were 10 plus miles away, which meant that they had to take the train all the way over here and then walk from the train stop to the store, which if you don't know, that's not a very pleasant way of getting to work or going to work. And I mentioned this in a previous video, but sometimes these people would take a $20 to $25 Uber ride to work and then make what it cost them to Uber to work in that day, because you weren't guaranteed an 8-hour shift. When you work in retail, a lot of the shifts are smaller, right? It wasn't uncommon for me at Kroger's to get a 3 or a 4 hour shift on any given day. And when you would ask why they did that, they would say it's simple. The reason why we schedule people like this is because we don't want to have to pay people health benefits. That's coming from the hiring manager. That's not something that, oh, I found out myself. That actually came from the actual employer. It's like, well, we don't want full-time workers here. When I worked in retail, there was no such thing. When you'd ask the general manager, it's like everyone here is part-time. And I was just like, okay, well, that shut me up. So moving on to this. So it wrote me this when I added that part about job interviewing while you're on the city bus. So it wrote an entire section on this question because it is very, very common in nearly every job that you go to. If you're relying on the bus and facing these challenges, you're not alone. The system is designed to favor those who can afford a car, and that creates a vicious cycle where economic inequality persists. Here's how you can respond to the reliable transportation question. Frame your answer positively. Emphasize punctuality and preparation. For example, I rely on public transportation, but I ensure my schedule allows me to arrive early to avoid any potential delays. You can do that all day long. You can schedule yourself as much time as you think you're going to need. But when it comes to public service, when it comes to public transportation, you can never prepare enough. Because let's say the bus driver's having a bad day that day, right? He doesn't see you or pretends not to see you, despite waving your arms at the bus stop so that they would stop when it looked like they weren't going to stop. Well, I've done this 100 times. You chase the bus on your bike down the street because the bus goes really slow and it stops a lot. So you can usually catch up to it. And I did this for like 3 different bus stops that I went to try to cut the bus off so I could get to work on time. And that bus driver would not pick me up. Absolutely not. And I was just like, okay, how am I going to tell my employer that I'm going to be an hour late because I couldn't get on a bus? Your employer doesn't want to hear about your personal problems. They have enough problems without having to deal with Johnny Sixpack with no car. So, moving on to our second one on this. Get involved in local movements pushing for improved public transportation. That's not going to work. Some companies are more understanding. No, not. These answers do not hit the mark in any conceivable way. Let's just put it this way from their perspective. You're doing the job interview and you hear the words, you don't have public transportation. I would find any way of making certain that you weren't picked for that job. And I can understand why, because I've been that employee my whole life who can't get to work on time. Sure, maybe 75% of the time you get to work on time because I would give myself half an hour. But the rest of the time, the public transportation is too unreliable to keep a basic job. And these jobs that people are going to are minimum wage jobs. And even those people know that they can find someone with a car. And like myself, that limits your ability of where you can work. And so if you can't walk there, then you can't work there. And that puts, like, in my situation right now, let's say I lost my current job, and that led down, it was a domino effect, right? You lose your job, then you lose your house, then you lose your car. And now you're homeless and you're looking for work. That puts you in even a worse situation. Everything about being poor can put you into a worse situation. But where I was going to go with that is that not having a car would limit me to working at Kroger's, Circle K, Burger King, Dutch Brothers, or what else? All the other little businesses that usually have one person working at them. And that means that there's going to be a very difficult time with even finding a full-time hours at a minimum wage job. And so that's why I decided to make this particular video, because I want you guys to understand that being poor comes with a lot more disadvantages that you could ever imagine. Because everything about the system when you don't have money is against you. And climbing out of that system is nearly impossible. Look at me. I've spent nearly my entire life trying to climb out of poverty. I can't. I know that as long as I'm alive, I am never going to be a person of means. I am never going to have stable employment. I am never going to own a home. I'm never going to have a family. And having no friends and nothing to do ever, you have to consciously tell yourself not to give in to the dire loneliness. Because you have to train yourself that this is your life. It may be the crappiest life that anyone's ever lived, but it's your life. You have to wake up every morning in your bed in this crappy place, and you have to tell yourself this is your reality. And if you give in to the darkness, you won't be around for very much longer.